The Wyoming wind cut through Jake Daniels like a rusted blade as he guided his weary horse down the mountain trail. October of 1897 had brought an early frost to the territory, and Jake could feel winter's promise in every gust that swept across the rocky terrain. His destination was the small mining town of Silver Ridge, where he hoped to find work and shelter before the snows made travel impossible. Jake was a man in his 40s, weathered by years of wandering the frontier. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of too many harsh winters and scorching summers spent under the open sky. A former cavalry scout turned drifter, he carried few possessions beyond his horse, his rifle, and the bitter memories that had driven him from place to place for the past 8 years. The crying reached his ears before he saw its source, a thin, desperate wailing that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. Jake's horse, a steady bay mare named Molly, pricked her ears forward and nickered softly. Something about the sound made Jake's blood run cold. It wasn't the cry of a wounded animal or the call of a bird. It was unmistakably human. "Easy, girl," Jake murmured, guiding Molly toward the sound. They rounded a bend in the trail, and there, nestled between 2 large boulders beside a dried creek bed, was a wicker basket. Jake dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. The frontier had taught him to be cautious of anything unexpected, and an abandoned basket in the middle of nowhere definitely qualified. But as he approached, the crying grew louder and more urgent, and Jake realized what he was looking at. Inside the basket, wrapped in a tattered quilt, was a baby. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old, with a shock of dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was red-faced from crying, her tiny fists waving in the air as she protested her abandonment. But it wasn't the baby that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. It was the crude wooden sign nailed to the side of the basket. Carved in rough letters were the words, "Devil's child cursed, do not take." Jake stared at the sign for a long moment, then looked down at the crying infant. Whatever superstitions or fears had led someone to abandon this child, Jake saw only what any decent person would see. A helpless baby who needed care and protection. "Well, little one," he said softly, kneeling beside the basket, "looks like someone's played you a dirty hand." The baby's crying subsided slightly when she heard his voice, and her gray eyes seemed to focus on his face. Jake had limited experience with infants, but he could see that she was healthy, though obviously hungry and cold. Her skin was pale but not feverish, and her crying was strong. Signs that whatever had led to her abandonment, it wasn't illness. Jake looked around the desolate landscape, searching for any sign of who might have left her there. The trail showed evidence of recent passage, wagon wheels and horse hooves in the soft earth, but the tracks were already being obscured by the wind. Whoever had abandoned the baby was long gone. "This is a hell of a thing," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. He'd spent 8 years avoiding human entanglements, keeping to himself, and moving on whenever the weight of his past threatened to catch up with him. The last thing he needed was responsibility for another human being, especially one so completely helpless. But as he looked down at the baby, now watching him with those solemn gray eyes, Jake felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was dead forever. It was the same protective instinct that had once made him a good soldier, a good husband, and a good father, before the fever had taken his wife and son and left him with nothing but grief and guilt. "Can't leave you out here, can I?" he said, more to himself than to the baby. "Winter's coming, and the wolves will be hungry." Jake carefully lifted the basket and carried it to where Molly stood waiting. The horse sniffed curiously at the baby, but showed no alarm. If anything, she seemed to approve of the tiny passenger. "What do you think, girl?" Jake asked his mare. "Think we can manage one more mouth to feed?" Molly snorted and pawed the ground, which Jake chose to interpret as agreement. He secured the basket as safely as possible on his saddle, then mounted carefully to avoid jostling his unexpected cargo. The remainder of the journey to Silver Ridge was slow and careful. Jake found himself constantly checking on the baby, who had settled into an uneasy sleep. Every few miles, he stopped to give her water from his canteen and to check that she was warm enough in her makeshift cradle. Silver Ridge appeared in the distance, just as the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. It was a typical frontier mining town, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, most of them bearing the weathered look of structures that had been built quickly and might not last long. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, and the warm glow of lanterns in windows promised shelter from the gathering cold. But as Jake rode into town, he became acutely aware of the stares his arrival was drawing. The sight of a lone drifter was common enough, but a drifter carrying a baby was unusual enough to merit attention. He could see people emerging from buildings and gathering on the wooden sidewalks to get a better look. Evening. Jake called to a group of men standing outside what appeared to be the town's only saloon. "I'm looking for somewhere to stable my horse and maybe find a room for the night." One of the men, a heavy-set fellow with a badge pinned to his vest, stepped forward. "I'm Sheriff Tom Brennan. Don't believe I've seen you before, mister. Name's Jake Daniels. I'm heading through, looking for work before winter sets in." Sheriff Brennan's eyes moved to the basket secured to Jake's saddle. "That wouldn't happen to be a baby you're carrying, would it?" "It would," Jake replied evenly. "Found her abandoned on the trail about 10 miles back. Someone left her to die." A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Jake could see the mixture of curiosity and suspicion in their faces. In frontier towns, strangers were always viewed with caution, and a stranger with an unexplained baby was cause for even greater concern. "Mind if I take a look?" Brennan asked, though it was clearly more of a demand than a request. Jake dismounted and carefully lifted the basket down. The baby had awakened and was beginning to fuss again, clearly hungry and uncomfortable after the long ride. As Jake pulled back the quilt to show she was unharmed, several people in the crowd gasped and stepped back. It wasn't the baby that alarmed them. It was the wooden sign still attached to the basket. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "It's the devil's child." "Who would leave such a thing on a baby?" asked a woman with kind eyes and graying hair. "Someone who believes in old superstitions," Jake replied firmly. "But I don't see anything devilish about a hungry infant." Dr. Michael Harrison pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He was a man in his 50s with gentle eyes and steady hands. "Let me examine her," he said. "Make sure she's healthy." Jake handed over the basket gratefully. Dr. Harrison lifted the baby carefully, his experienced hands checking for injury or illness. After thorough examination, he looked up with relief. "She's perfectly healthy," he announced. "Maybe 3 months old, a little underweight from hunger, but nothing that proper feeding won't fix. Someone has taken reasonable care of her until recently. The question is, what do we do with her now?" Sheriff Brennan asked. "I'll take care of her," Jake said without hesitation. The crowd exchanged glances. A grizzled prospector named Pete Collins spoke up. "Begging your pardon, mister, but you don't look like the kind of man who knows much about raising babies." "I raised a son once," Jake replied quietly, "before the fever took him and my wife." The admission hung in the air like a challenge. These people didn't know his story, didn't know about the ranch in Colorado where he'd once been a husband and father. They only saw a drifter with worn clothes and a weathered face. "Be that as it may," Dr. Harrison said diplomatically, "caring for an infant requires certain resources. Milk, proper shelter, warm clothes." "I have money," Jake said, "and I'm willing to work for what I need." Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, the woman with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. Daniels, I run the boarding house here in town. I could provide you with a room, and I know something about caring for babies. I raised 4 of my own." Jake felt a wave of gratitude toward this stranger who was offering help without judgment. "That's very kind of you, ma'am. I'd be grateful for any assistance." "There's still the matter of that sign," Sheriff Brennan said, nodding toward the basket. "Whoever left her obviously believed she was cursed or some such nonsense." "Superstition," Dr. Harrison said firmly. "There's nothing wrong with this child that food and care won't cure." But Jake could see that not everyone in the crowd was convinced. Some of the townspeople were still staring at the baby with fear and suspicion, as if expecting her to sprout horns or burst into flames. The Devil's Child sign had clearly struck a chord with people who lived hard lives on the edge of civilization where unexplained events were often attributed to supernatural forces. "I'll be keeping the child," Jake said, his voice carrying a tone of finality. "Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me directly." The crowd began to disperse, though Jake could see small groups of people talking in hushed tones as they walked away. He had no doubt that the story of the Devil's Child would be told and retold throughout the town before morning. Mrs. Carter approached with a warm smile. "Come along, Mr. Daniels. Let's get you and the little one settled in. She'll need feeding, and you both look like you could use a hot meal." As they walked toward the boarding house, Jake carrying the basket, while Mrs. Carter cooed softly at the baby, Jake felt a mixture of determination and uncertainty. He'd made an impulsive decision to take responsibility for this child, but he had no idea what challenges lay ahead. "Mrs. Carter," he said as they reached the front porch of the boarding house, "I should tell you, I'm not sure how long I'll be staying in Silver Ridge." "That's all right, dear. We'll take things one day at a time." She paused and looked down at the baby, who was watching them both with those remarkable gray eyes. "What will you call her?" Jake realized he hadn't even thought about a name. Looking down at the child who'd already changed his life in the space of a few hours, he considered the possibilities. "Hope," he said finally. "Her name is Hope." Mrs. Carter smiled. "That's a beautiful name. Very appropriate." As they entered the warm, well-lit boarding house, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd rescued this child from certain death, but now he had to figure out how to raise her in a world that had already judged her as cursed. But as Hope looked up at him with trust in her gray eyes, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 8 years, a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them. He'd failed to protect his own family once, but he wouldn't fail this child. The Devil's Child had found a protector, and Jake Daniels had found a reason to stop running from his past. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's arrival in Silver Ridge with Hope, and the routine they'd established was beginning to feel almost natural. Each morning, Jake would help Mrs. Carter with chores around the boarding house, while Hope napped in a proper cradle that the town's carpenter, Samuel Wright, had built at no charge. Afternoons were spent working at Thompson's General Store, where Jake had found employment moving freight and managing inventory. The work was steady but not well-paying, and Jake found himself constantly calculating expenses. Milk for Hope, warmer clothes as winter approached, and the weekly fee for their room at Mrs. Carter's boarding house. Hope was growing rapidly, her appetite increasing daily, and Jake was discovering that raising a child was far more expensive than he'd remembered. But it wasn't just the financial challenges that weighed on his mind. Despite Dr. Harrison's medical confirmation of Hope's perfect health, and despite Jake's own obvious competence as a caretaker, whispers still followed them wherever they went. "That's the Devil's Child," Jake would hear people murmur when he carried Hope through town for their daily walks. Some residents crossed themselves when they saw her, while others made subtle signs to ward off evil. A few of the more superstitious townspeople had even asked Sheriff Brennan to investigate whether Jake might be involved in witchcraft or devil worship. The sheriff, to his credit, had dismissed such concerns as nonsense, but the atmosphere of suspicion was taking its toll on both Jake and Hope. The baby seemed to sense the tension around her, becoming fussy and difficult to comfort whenever they were in public. It was on a gray November morning that the situation came to a head. Jake was at Thompson's store, unloading a wagon of supplies that had arrived from Cheyenne, when he heard shouting from the direction of the boarding house. His blood ran cold as he recognized Mrs. Carter's voice, raised in anger and distress. "Stop this nonsense immediately," she was yelling. "Get away from my property." Jake dropped the crate he'd been carrying and ran toward the boarding house, his heart pounding with fear for Hope's safety. As he rounded the corner onto Main Street, he saw a crowd gathered in front of Mrs. Carter's establishment. At the center of the group was Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a traveling preacher who'd arrived in town 2 days earlier. Blackwood was a tall, thin man with wild hair and intense eyes that seemed to burn with religious fervor. He'd been holding revival meetings in the town's small church, preaching fire and brimstone sermons about the evils that threaten good Christian communities. "The devil has sent his spawn among us," Blackwood was proclaiming, his voice carrying clearly across the street. This innocent-seeming child is a vessel for evil, marked by Satan himself. Reverend Blackwood, you're frightening the baby, Mrs. Carter said firmly, standing in her doorway with Hope in her arms. The infant was crying loudly, clearly distressed by the shouting and the hostile atmosphere. She should be frightened, Blackwood declared. Her very presence corrupts this holy community. Jake pushed through the crowd, his jaw set and his eyes dangerous. That's enough, he said, his voice cutting through Blackwood's rhetoric like a blade. The preacher turned to face him, his eyes gleaming with fanatic certainty. Ah, the keeper of the devil's child. I should have known you'd appear when your master's work was threatened. The only evil I see here is a man terrorizing a helpless baby, Jake replied, stepping closer to Blackwood. And that stops now. You cannot silence the word of God, Blackwood proclaimed, raising his arms dramatically. This child bears the mark of Satan. She must be cleansed or cast out before she brings damnation upon us all. Several people in the crowd murmured agreement, their faces showing the fear and uncertainty that Blackwood's words had stirred up. Jake could see that the preacher's inflammatory rhetoric was finding fertile ground in the minds of people already unsettled by superstition and hard living. The only mark she bears is the one left by whoever abandoned her, Jake said firmly. And if you want to talk about evil, let's talk about leaving a helpless infant to die in the wilderness. Dr. Harrison pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand and his face set with professional authority. Reverend Blackwood, I've examined this child thoroughly. She's perfectly normal and healthy. There's nothing supernatural about her. Science cannot detect spiritual corruption, Blackwood retorted. This child was marked by evil forces before birth. Her very existence threatens the souls of everyone in this community. Mrs. Carter's patience finally snapped. Josiah Blackwood, you're a fool and a troublemaker. This baby is no more evil than any other infant. Mr. Daniels has cared for her with devotion and kindness, and I won't have you spreading your poisonous nonsense on my property. Then you too have been corrupted by the devil's influence, Blackwood declared. All who aid this child are damned. The crowd was growing larger and more agitated. Jake could see that Blackwood's words were having an effect, turning curious onlookers into an angry mob. Some people were calling for Hope to be taken away from him, while others demanded that she be driven from the town entirely. Sheriff Brennan finally arrived, having been summoned by someone who'd witnessed the growing confrontation. What's all this commotion about? He demanded. This man is inciting people against an innocent child, Jake said, nodding toward Blackwood. I'm protecting this community from spiritual corruption, the preacher countered. This so-called innocent child is marked by Satan himself. Brennan looked around at the agitated crowd, then at Hope, who was still crying in Mrs. Carter's arms. Reverend, I think you've said enough. Why don't you move along and let folks get back to their business? You cannot silence God's messenger, Blackwood declared. This evil must be exposed. The only thing being exposed here is your ignorance, Dr. Harrison said angrily. This child is no different from any other baby. Your superstitious ranting is causing unnecessary fear and hatred. But Jake could see that the damage was already done. Blackwood's words had tapped into deep-seated fears and prejudices, and even those who didn't fully believe his rhetoric were now looking at Hope with suspicion and unease. Perhaps, said Mayor William Hastings, who had been drawn to the scene by the commotion, it would be best if Mr. Daniels considered moving on, for the peace and harmony of the community. The suggestion hit Jake like a physical blow. After 3 weeks of building a life in Silver Ridge, of establishing routines and connections, he was being asked to leave simply because some people were afraid of a helpless baby. Mayor Hastings, Mrs. Carter said indignantly, Mr. Daniels and Hope are paying guests at my establishment. They've done nothing wrong, and I won't have them driven away by superstitious nonsense. Mrs. Carter, we all respect your kindness, Hastings replied diplomatically, but we must consider what's best for the entire community. Jake looked around at the faces in the crowd, some hostile, some fearful, some merely curious. He realized that no matter what he said or did, There would always be people who saw hope as something unnatural and dangerous. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally, his voice carrying quiet determination. "This is a free country, and we have as much right to be here as anyone else. Not if your presence threatens the moral fabric of our community," Blackwood declared. "The only threat I see," Jake replied, "is a man who preys on people's fears to make himself feel important." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Hope's crying suddenly stopped. In the sudden quiet, everyone turned to look at the baby, who was now gazing around at the crowd with her remarkable gray eyes. For a moment, she seemed to study each face with an intelligence that was startling in one so young. Then she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her entire face and made her look like exactly what she was, a beautiful, innocent child. The effect on the crowd was immediate and profound. Some people stepped back, as if afraid of being charmed by evil forces. But others, particularly the women, felt their hearts melt at the sight of that innocent smile. "Look at her," Mrs. Carter said softly. "Look at that sweet face, and tell me you see anything evil." Mary Thompson, the store owner's wife, stepped forward hesitantly. She's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Just a baby, like any other." "Appearances can deceive," Blackwood warned, but his voice had lost some of its fire. Even he seemed affected by Hope's innocent charm. Dr. Harrison seized the moment. "This child represents nothing more than human cruelty, the cruelty of whoever abandoned her. But she also represents human compassion, the compassion of Mr. Daniels, who rescued her and has cared for her with dedication." Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward the doctor and Mrs. Carter for their support, but he also knew that this confrontation was just the beginning. As long as people like Blackwood were around to stir up fear and hatred, hope would never be fully accepted. "Reverend Blackwood," Sheriff Brennan said firmly, "I think you've caused enough disruption for one day. Why don't you head back to the church and leave these folks alone?" Blackwood glared at the sheriff, then at Jake and Hope. "This isn't over," he declared. "Evil cannot hide forever. The truth will be revealed, and this community will be cleansed." As the preacher stalked away, the crowd began to disperse, but Jake could see that the seeds of doubt and fear had been planted. Even those who'd been friendly before now looked at him and Hope with uncertainty. "Don't let him get to you," Mrs. Carter said, approaching Jake with Hope still in her arms. "There are good people in this town who can see past superstition." "I know," Jake replied, "but there are also people who are afraid of what they don't understand." That evening, as Jake sat in his room at the boarding house, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, he reflected on the challenges they faced. He'd hoped that time and familiarity would help the townspeople accept Hope as just another child. Instead, the arrival of Reverend Blackwood had made their situation more precarious than ever. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Carter entered, carrying a tray with coffee and fresh bread. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Thank you," Jake said gratefully, "and thank you for standing up for us today." Mrs. Carter looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully despite the day's turmoil. "She's a sweet child, Mr. Daniels. Anyone with eyes can see that." "Not everyone wants to see it," Jake replied. "No, some people prefer their fears to the truth, but there are others who are beginning to understand what you've done for her." Jake hoped she was right, but as he watched Hope sleep, her tiny face peaceful and innocent, he made a silent promise. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever fears and superstitions they had to face, he would protect this child with his life. The devil's child had found not just a protector, but a father who would never abandon her. And in a harsh world that had already judged her as cursed, that love might be the only thing standing between Hope and a very dark future. Winter had arrived in Silver Ridge with a vengeance, bringing heavy snows and bitter cold that kept most of the townspeople huddled indoors. For Jake and Hope, the isolation was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the harsh weather meant fewer confrontations with people who feared or distrusted the baby. On the other hand, it made their situation more precarious, as work became scarce and supplies grew expensive. Jake had managed to find winter employment helping to maintain the town's buildings and equipment, but the pay was irregular and barely enough to cover their basic needs. Hope was growing rapidly, requiring larger portions of milk and warmer clothing, and Jake found himself constantly worried about money. It was during this difficult time that Reverend Blackwood's influence reached its peak. With people trapped indoors by the weather, his evening sermons at the church became one of the few sources of entertainment and social interaction in town. And night after night, he continued to preach about the spiritual corruption that threatened their community. "The devil's spawn walks among us," he would declare from the pulpit, "testing our faith, seeking to corrupt our souls. We must remain vigilant against this evil." His words found fertile ground among people who were struggling with the hardships of frontier life. When babies died from winter illnesses, when mines collapsed or accidents occurred, Blackwood was quick to suggest that these misfortunes were connected to Hope's presence in their community. The situation came to a crisis point on a frigid January evening when tragedy struck the Henderson family. Their youngest child, 2-year-old Emma, fell through the ice on the creek while playing and drowned before anyone could save her. Dr. Harrison had been away in another town, dealing with an outbreak of influenza, and there was no one else with the medical knowledge to attempt resuscitation. Jake learned of the tragedy the next morning when he arrived at Thompson's store for work. The atmosphere in town was heavy with grief and anger, and he could feel hostile stares following him as he walked through the streets. "It's the curse," he heard someone whisper. "Ever since that devil's child came to town, bad things keep happening." That evening, Reverend Blackwood held a special memorial service for young Emma Henderson. The church was packed with grieving townspeople, and the preacher's words carried special weight in the atmosphere of loss and desperation. "This innocent child has been taken from us," Blackwood declared, his voice trembling with emotion. "Taken as a warning, as a sign that we have allowed evil to dwell among us unchallenged." Jake wasn't present at the service. He'd learned to avoid Blackwood's sermons, but Mrs. Carter attended and reported the preacher's words to him afterward. "He's claiming that Emma's death is connected to Hope," she told Jake, her face pale with worry. "He's saying that as long as she remains in town, more children will die." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. What was the response? Some people were nodding and agreeing. Others looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke against him. Mrs. Carter paused, her expression troubled. "Jake, I'm worried. The mood in town is turning uglier." Her fears proved justified the next morning, when Jake found a crowd gathered outside the boarding house. Led by Blackwood, about 20 townspeople stood in the snow, their faces grim with determination. "We've come to discuss the situation," Mayor Hastings announced as Jake stepped onto the porch. The mayor looked uncomfortable but resolute, clearly influenced by pressure from his constituents. "What situation is that?" Jake asked, though he knew exactly what they meant. "The presence of that child," Blackwood said, pointing toward the boarding house. "Her evil influence has brought death to our community. First the mining accidents, then the illness that swept through the eastern settlements, and now poor little Emma Henderson." "Coincidences," Jake replied firmly. "Tragedies that happen in frontier communities everywhere." "3 children have died since she arrived," declared Martha Stevens, a stern woman who ran the town's small school. 3 innocent souls taken while the devil's spawn thrives." Jake felt his temper rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. Hope is not responsible for deaths that had nothing to do with her. "She carries the mark of Satan," Blackwood proclaimed. "Her very presence invites disaster." Dr. Harrison chose that moment to arrive, having returned from his journey to the eastern settlements. He was exhausted and grief-stricken by his failure to save Emma Henderson, but his voice was steady when he spoke.